It's 5 o'clock in London, midday in New York, midnight in Hong Kong, 2 a.m. in Sydney, 9 a.m. in San Francisco, and 9:30 at night in Mumbai. Greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you are in the world today. My name is Patrick L. Young. The IPO video live stream, Series 25, Episode 1, that's episode number 145 in the aggregate, starts here. And in Europe, regulatory agility has been raised as ESMA have waded into the debate on rejuvenating European Union capital markets. Maybe they should read our guest Rainer Zitelmann's new book to better understand the dynamics of growth. Over in India, we had wondered how the Bombay Stock Exchange, National Stock Exchange, respectively, would value their gift city markets. The end result is clearly far too valuable compared to the other party. No deal to a proposed merger, so the BSE subsidiary India INX and the NSE IX will remain independent. Over in BitCarnage, we've been discussing the Bahamas property conundrum. The truth is, way back when it went bust, we noted that SBF, Sam Bankman-Fried, and FTX were the market in Bahamas property. Now liquidators are seeking to set a full quarter's inventory by selling all at once his $300 worth of property. I think what we can expect is price cuts. And of course, this one has a time value decay because the liquidators are paying all sorts of extortionate fees for those lovely gated community properties month on month. So therefore, they're eager to sell. $300 million worth of property represents about 20% of the entire year, something like that, in the whole of the Bahamas. It's pretty much a full quarter, even the best of years. And apparently, we're in a little bit of a pushback at the moment in the Bahamas real estate market. So if you're looking for top-end property, try Nassau. New Providence could be the place to be. Now, our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, is a returning guest, Dr. Rainer Zitelmann. We had him previously joining us for episode IPO-VID 104, 116, and 135, when he was speaking about three of his books, The Fabulous in Defense of Capitalism, The Magnificent, The Wealth Elite, and indeed recently his Unbreakable Spirit, an absolute classic of a tome altogether. We're here today to discuss another fabulous book in that canon, How Nations Escape Poverty. So, just to give you a very quick introduction, if you haven't heard it before, historian and sociologist Rainer Zitelmann is a serial best-selling author. His books include Defense of Capitalism, have been translated into 30 languages around the world. His opinion pieces have appeared worldwide. I was just reading one this morning in Quillette. We'll get onto that in just a few minutes. They've also appeared in the likes of Forbes, Newsweek, The Daily Telegraph, The Times, Le Monde, Corriere del Sera, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, and Neue Zürcher Zeitung, as well as publications across South America and Asia. Rainer runs a unique index on the image of rich people, having spent much time analysing the personality traits of the rich. So, Rainer, we're here today to discuss poverty, but first of all, where in the world are you today?
I'm in Berlin.
Fantastic. Welcome back. Welcome back to From Berlin once again. So tell me a little bit about this new book, because the one thing that strikes me is all those other books that we've been talking about all the time. You're talking about incredible superpowers, wealth, making money, wealth. And then this one says how we escape poverty. It's a slightly different angle on a very, very interesting topic.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we, people who believe in capitalism, should speak more about poverty, because sometimes people think capitalism is something that is important only for rich people, for wealthy people. But I have an absolutely different opinion. I think capitalism is much more important for poor people, for the weak, because strong people, they come along in almost every system. But for people living in poverty, capitalism is the only hope. And I showed in my book with two examples, two countries, Poland and Vietnam. And both countries have a lot in common. First, they were victims of terrible wars. In Poland, more people were killed in the Second World War than in any other country, of course, adjusted to population as a percentage of the population. And Vietnam had not only the war with the United States, but before with France, and then with Japan, then with China. So they were in war with almost everyone. And And both countries have another thing in common. After the war, a planned economy, a socialist planned economy, was established in both countries, in Vietnam and in Poland. And the most important thing, and this is what my book is about, they understood in the end of the 80s that the planned economy does not work, and they started in both countries with free market reforms. And now, since 3 decades, Poland is definitely Europe's growth champion, and Vietnam is one of the fastest growing countries. I give you only at the beginning one number about Vietnam. What a lot of people don't know is that Vietnam was 1990 the poorest country in the world, poorer than all African countries. And the number of people living in extreme poverty was 80%. And today it's less than 5%. And in my book, I describe how could it happen for Vietnam and Poland. It's a little bit similar. Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe in the 80s. And since 3 decades, it's Europe's growth champion. And how could it happen? This is the topic of my book.
So it's a very, very interesting tale, because both countries have had a very interesting legacy history. They found themselves in challenging geographical circumstances, certainly geopolitical circumstances, because they tended to have been right in the middle between great power blocks. And they both were plunged into the iniquity of some form of application of communism, Marxism, Leninism, whatever. And then they staged this incredible bounce back, as you say, in the 1990s. And what do you think were the reasons that these countries in particular staged such an aggressive bounce back?
There were different reasons, and I have to underline that they did it both in a different way. In Poland, there was a kind of what we call shock therapy, something similar as Javier Milei tries to do in Argentina today. By the way, there are more similarities between Argentina and Poland, because the great reformer in Poland, who was the finance minister and vice premier minister, Balcerowicz, he was a professor for economics. He believed in Austrian economics, the teachings of Hayek and Mises. And Milei is the same. Milei is also a professor for Austrian economics, and he believes in the same teachings from Hayek and Mises. They have a complete different personality. Milei is very extreme, how he speaks, very aggressive, and Balcerowicz is more, as you think about, a professor for economics, but they believe in the same ideas. And so I think, for example, Argentina can learn a lot from the example from Poland. For me, it was very important that this book, where we are talking about, will be published in Argentina in August. I asked Milei to write a preface, but he recommended me his spokesman of the government, Manuel Adorno, who's also economist, and he wrote the preface for the book. And why is this so important? The lesson of Poland shows 2 things. First, it's possible to escape poverty even using the so-called shock therapy. But the other thing is, and this is much more important, first, things will become worse before they become better. This is what a lot of people don't understand, but we saw it also in the UK, for example, when Maggie Thatcher did her economic reforms. First, some things become worse, and this was the case in Poland. For example, hidden unemployment became open unemployment, and there was a decrease in the GDP for 2 years. So some things first become worse. And this is so important for people in Argentina to understand it today. I wrote a preface for the Spanish edition of the book that will be published soon. And it's only one page with the headline, "Be patient," because what went wrong in Argentina, for example, now for 60 or 70 years, can't be fixed in 6 months. I think it's logical, but I think there are a lot of people who expect very fast changes. And I think Milei did some good things. Even now in Argentina, inflation came down, but there will be serious problems. And people, they can choose. This is what I wrote in my preface, between two alternatives. The first thing, be patient, wait 2 or 3 years until things become better, or go back to the old system, the perilous system that didn't work for decades and decades, and then you will stay in poverty. You know, today 40% of the people in Argentina live in poverty. So this is why the book is so important. 2 reasons. For everyone, it's important because I show with 2 real world examples from 2 countries how nations can escape poverty. And the next thing is that we have some lessons for other countries, lessons to learn from these both examples.
That's very, very interesting altogether. And obviously, I think raising the comparison to Argentina is quite fascinating. And also, I think, well, indeed, at the opening today, I think I missed out the fact that we're delighted to see that the former Mexter CEO, Jorge Alegría, is rejoining the Mexican Exchange BMV Group as CEO, as the Mexican Exchange boss's Jose Oriol Bosch is stepping down after a decade. So there's reform happening there in Mexico. Argentine capital markets, I'm not so sure about at the moment, but certainly it's a fascinating comparison when you look at, as you say, I mean, I haven't met Milei, I've seen him, and obviously, yes, he does come across as a man in a hurry, somewhat bombastic, whereas, I mean, Balcerowicz just strikes you as a very normal, calm academic. Yet, if ever there was a man for whom the phrase an economic iron fist inside a velvet glove was to be appropriated, I think it was him. I mean, his shock therapy was quite incredible. The other thing that interests me here is, you know, Balcerowicz came to power as a result of really nobody else in the room wanting to be the finance minister. Everybody thought it was an impossible poisoned chalice. So it more or less went round the room, and it came to this relatively junior academic, Balcerowicz, and said to him, well, okay, Leszek, would you like to be finance minister? He picked up the ball and ran with it and never looked back. And we see that with Milei. I mean, Milei is really the choice of, he's got no particularly huge party. He's the person everybody voted for because he was just not the status quo in many respects. Is there a similar situation in Vietnam, or how did the origins of the Vietnamese economic growth come about? Was it collective or thanks to a key individual or two?
First, what is very important to understand, whether you want to understand the development in Vietnam or the development in China in the 80s, capitalism is nothing that you can implement only bottom up. It's a grassroots movement. Peasants start to leave, for example, these collectives, and they started to go back to capitalism on a simple reason, because it was a desperate situation. There were starvation and hunger. They had no alternative. They saw that it didn't work. So they started to do a lot of things. I described this in my book. And later, what the communists did, the Communist Party, first they legalized what the peasants did anyway before. By the way, this was the same exactly what happened in China. There were a lot of spontaneous developments, and this confirms what Hayek said, that capitalism is a result of a spontaneous development. The only thing that politicians can do, they can forbid it and punish people, or they can legalize it and allow it. And in Vietnam, it started in 1986 with the 6th Congress of the Communist Party. And what I admire very much for Vietnam, they were very honest to themselves. They understood that the economic situation was their own fault. And why is this important? It's the same for a country as it is for an individual. We had this in our conversation about my book about disabled people, that successful people, they don't blame others. They don't look in external circumstances, but they take the responsibility for their success and for their failure. And this is a difference also between successful countries and other countries. I will compare it with a lot of African countries. Still today, they see themselves as victims. We are victims of colonialism and slavery and all this stuff, and the Western countries, United States or the UK or whoever, they're responsible for our situation. And so we want a lot of money for them now, like development aid, to improve our situation. I have a chapter in my book, How Nations Escape Poverty, that proves development aid did not work. You can see it in Africa. It did not work, didn't improve the situation. And the people in Vietnam, they could blame, of course, other countries for their situation. There were a lot of countries that they could blame. In the first case, the United States. You have to know that in the Second World War, that there were more bombs and explosives from the United States on Vietnam, 10 times more than on Germany in the Second World War, 10 times more. And a lot of people were killed. We know about this war. So they had reason. They could blame the Americans. We are so poor because of the aggression from the United States or France before, or China or Japan. But this is what they did not. They blamed themselves. They saw that the planned economy did not work. And so they started with free market reforms. They introduced private property. They called these reforms Doi Moi reforms. That means to renew the country. And of course, it took a couple of years. In Vietnam, it was the same thing. You can't fix problems that have roots so long ago. And it took a time, but they were very successful. And today, the difference is also they opened the economy for foreign investors. They welcome foreign investors. I have there in my book some pages from a German lawyer who lives now since 25 years in Vietnam. By the way, if you want to do something in Vietnam, I can strongly recommend to work with him. He's a lot of experience now, this 25 years. And he was also involved in the negotiation of the treaty of the free trade contracts between the United States and Vietnam. And I want to point out the difference between Vietnam on the one hand and some very poor countries on the other hand. Vietnam, they understood that foreign investors will help them. They understood that they need the money from foreign investors to improve their situation. And I've been some months ago in Nepal, and also an Asian country, and they have exactly the opposite attitude. They have a long list who's not allowed to invest in their country because they think that foreign investors will harm them. And so they have long lists who's not allowed to invest there and where it's not possible to invest in Nepal. And this is the absolutely opposite from Vietnam. So I think this is something economists sometimes underestimate. It's also a question of the mindset of a country, and that in Vietnam they didn't look back. Of course, they have memories about the war, and I've been there in museums about the war. Of course, they remember the war, but not in this way that they blame the Americans or they blame the war for the situation. On the contrary, they love Americans. I met a young female entrepreneur, and she told me, my parents told me, dress like American, eat like American, hear the same music, and think like American, then you will be successful. I don't know whether this is true, but you see, they have a very positive attitude to the United States. And I admire people who don't look back. You know, there are some people, all their time, their life, they look back, what have my parents done to me and all this stuff. They didn't do it. They see what's happening now and how can we create our own future. And this mindset, I think, is very often underestimated by economists who look only for legal things or numbers that are also important. But I think much more important is the way how people think in Vietnam. And later I can tell also something how they think in Poland.
Well, I'm intrigued. Let's carry on with that. Actually, have a sip of water while we're talking about this, but it's an intriguing issue. Actually, why don't we jump to this week's book while we're giving it a little rest, as we're about a third of the way through the show. So this week we've got a fabulous book. It's a classic, ladies and gentlemen, really a classic. The Innovator's Dilemma by Professor Clayton Christensen, who died unfortunately a few years ago. It's a truly classic business book. It outlines how companies usually foresee the future, then hope it doesn't emerge because it'll ruin their existing business model. As pertinent as it was when it first came out a generation ago, the late Professor Christensen explains how committees and management in slow-moving corporates across multiple sectors have hoped the future just won't emerge the way their more visionary staff have expected it to. More importantly, their most visionary staff were almost invariably wrong or right, which of course is the innovator's dilemma, ladies and gentlemen. Management wrong, innovation right, and you have a huge pickle. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the people then in Poland and how they approach things, because obviously they too have a reasonable opportunity to feel somewhat badly done by the course of 20th century history.
Yes, of course. There were the Germans and the Russians and so on. But what is especially important in Poland, by the way, also in Vietnam, for my book, I commissioned a poll in 35 countries, a poll about the image of capitalism, the image of the market economy. And one of the results was that there is no other country in the world where people have such a positive attitude towards capitalism than in Poland. Poland is number one, even before countries like the United States or South Korea or Japan or the Czech Republic. And so people have a very positive attitude towards the market economy and capitalism because they saw that it works. They saw that they escaped poverty because of introducing capitalism. And another thing, in 13 countries, I had a poll about the image of wealthy people, the image of rich people. By the way, I published also 2 papers in economic affairs. I can send you the links, and maybe you can add it to the show notes about Excellent. Both of the surveys about the image of capitalism and about the image of wealthy people. And the one question in my survey about the image of wealthy people was how envious are people against the rich. By the way, the most envious people in this survey were people in France, followed unfortunately by my own country, Germany. And on the other end was Poland. So Polish people are the least envious people. They have a much more positive attitude towards wealthy people, towards rich people. And this is also true for Vietnam. In Vietnam, rich people are not scapegoats as they are in a lot of Western countries today, where rich people are scapegoats and are blamed for all bad things happening in the world. No, they are more like role models. And so you see it if you compare the answers to the questions about rich people in Poland and in Vietnam, that in both countries they have a very positive attitude towards rich people. And even in Vietnam, I spoke in Hanoi at 4 prestigious universities. One of these universities was the Foreign Trade University in Hanoi, and they read my books and my papers, and then they did their own research about the image of wealthy people. They came to the same conclusions as I, and then they invited me to a workshop, and the topic of the workshop was, how can we improve the image of wealthy people? I was never invited to a workshop with a topic like this in the United States or in Europe. I think it's very hard to find a university in Europe or in the United States where scholars think about the question, how can we improve the image of wealthy people, in spite of the fact that it is already very positive in Vietnam. So you see, I think it makes a difference for the economy whether successful entrepreneurs are role models or whether successful entrepreneurs are scapegoats.
Yes, quite fascinating. The positivity of it all. And actually, we've got a great point made here by our commodities doyen, Anne Berg, also a former IPO-VID guest. And she says, Rainer, brilliant. I found the same entrepreneurial spirit and pro-Americanism when I worked in Vietnam in 2014 on market development. Women especially. Thanks for pointing this out to listeners. Thank you very much, Anne. It's a great point. Rainer.
Yes, it's great. And she should definitely read my book, because I have also something about women. What she said about women is very important. I forgot it. So thank you for this. Women play a much more important role in Vietnam in business than in Europe, for example, or in my country, or in the United States. You have much more women in leading positions, but not because any feminism. I heard nothing in Vietnam about woke ideology or feminism or this stuff. I asked them, do we have something like this? They told me, yes, if some of our young people studied in the United States and they come back, they bring these crazy ideas with woke ideology, but not in Vietnam. No, but women play a very important role there in Vietnam. And funny thing was, in our survey about the image of wealthy people, we had one question: how important is it for you to become rich? For example, I think in the United States it was something like 28%, I don't know exactly now, something in the 20s. In Asian countries, on average, it was 48%, but in Vietnam, it was 76% of all people who said, for me, it's very important to become rich. And now, for what is important about women, Vietnam was the only country where more women than men said that it's very important for them to become rich. I think for women, it was like 82%, and for men, 72%. Also a lot of men, but so this is very important. And why is it important? I found similar things in China, because we as Europeans or Americans, sometimes we say we Americans or Europeans are more individualists. So for us, the individual is more important. And for Asians, they have this collectivist spirit. maybe there's something true in this, but also I see exactly the opposite. For example, if you compare women in the United States or in Europe, there are a lot of women who believe in feminism. How should we should have quota for women in leading positions. We have this discussion in Germany in politics, or as in the board of companies and other stuff. You have no discussion like this in China or in Vietnam. But women in Vietnam, and the same is true for China, they look more, how can I improve my situation? How can I become rich? Not fighting for rights for all women in the politics, but how can I improve it? And I think this is a very individualistic approach, and I see it. I had lectures about my book, The Wealth Elite. We talked about this book, Psychology of the Super Rich. It's published in Vietnam, it's published in China. And when I talk about this in Europe, I think 90% in the audience is male. And most of the women, the 10%, they are maybe girlfriend or wife from a man who came there. In Vietnam or in China, I think something like 50% in the audience are women. And so you see, they are much more interested in this topic. So I'm very pleased about this. I forgot the name. She should definitely buy the book. She will.
Anne Berg. Yeah, I've got better news for you, actually. I hate to interrupt you, but I will read it. There you go. You have a sale. Ka-ching. Anne Berg will be buying your book, Rainer, in the very near future. She's probably on Amazon right at this moment. Who knows? But certainly, it's a great read, and I thoroughly recommend it, ladies and gentlemen. I've got to say, it's a fabulous read altogether. So, Anne Berg, talking about Vietnam and so on, let me take the discussion back to Poland. I think it's very interesting what you say about the pro-Americanism, the pro-external faction of what goes on, because certainly one of the things which fascinates me about Poland, and I was back there for quite a while last year, having not been back for a couple of years, and again this year. And the interesting thing I note there is that, frankly, the government since Balcerowicz has been a disappointment. And that's not a party political comment. They were all disappointments. I mean, the governments immediately after Balcerowicz basically were in a rallentando. Nobody has ever managed to dismantle the fundamental Balcerowicz reforms, which has kept the economy going. And what I now find intriguing is, it strikes me the Polish working classes, and I mean working class, middle class, the Polish entrepreneurial classes as well, they essentially thrive entirely in spite of what the government does, because the playing field is so good that they can play on it, compared to what their parents or grandparents have, which was communism, which was you can't do anything or we'll lock you up.
Yes, absolutely. This is what Adam Smith even wrote in his book, The Wealth of Nations. By the way, you note, I start my book with a chapter about Adam Smith's philosophy. And Adam Smith said, even in spite of the state, in spite of all the crazy things that the government does, a country can be sometimes successful because if they have very inspiring entrepreneurs, as we have in Poland. And what you said about the governments in Poland, I agree with, especially this Peace Party that were in rule for between 2015 and last year. Last year, they stopped privatization, and even they nationalized some banks, and they did a lot of redistribution. So we call them in Germany a far right wing party, or the media in Germany call them right wing. In a way, maybe it's correct as it comes to questions of the nation, of family, or especially migration. But in the economies, it's a very left party.
Quite right.
Party, and I was surprised, by the way. This is a funny story. When I got we in our poll, we asked, in addition to all these questions about capitalism and the market economy, we asked all our respondents to position themselves on a left-right scale. So 0 means extreme left, 10 extreme right, 5 center, and we asked everyone, where are you? Maybe 6, 7, or 4, or 3, and then we looked whether there's a correlation between the attitude to capitalism on the one hand and this left-right on the other hand. And it was not a surprise that in most of the countries, the more left-leaning people were more anti-capitalist than people on the moderate right or the right. But in Poland, I saw a different result, that the strongest support for capitalism was on the moderate left. And after I got these results, I called the polling institute and told them, here, I don't believe it. I think there is a mistake in this poll. Please double check. Here I have the result that the moderate left are most pro-capitalist in Poland. We have it in no other country. I think there is any mistake, maybe with the coding or something like this. They double checked it and they said, no, it's all correct. There's not a mistake. Still, I didn't believe it. Even in the German edition of my book, I had a footnote that I had some doubts about this result. But then I've been in Poland and I spoke with people who said, yes, of course, this Peace Party people, these are the people who are envious against the rich, and in the moderate left, we have more pro-capitalist. So sometimes you have to go to these countries to understand what really happens. This is one thing. The other thing, if we spoke about the attitude to the United States, and this is also interesting. In Poland, people, I think it's the most pro-American country in Europe. Maybe Albania and Poland are the most pro-capitalist countries in Europe. We have a lot of anti-Americanism, unfortunately, in my country, Germany, of course, in France, of course, also in Italy and Spain. But Polish people, they love America. And I think in a way it's linked. There's anti-capitalism and anti-Americanism.
Yes, it's a very interesting strand of thought, and certainly I find it quite interesting because I think, I'm not sure. PiS, I certainly don't think did a great job in Poland, and they were. But as you say, they're anything but far right. I mean, they're traditionally conservative in many senses, but in terms of family values and things like that, they're not free marketeers, and that's something that I've been pointing out for a long time. They're absolute out-and-out socialists, which I find quite interesting because they actually are all supposedly the people who are the most ardently anti-communist, and yet they themselves are the most keen to manipulate the economy or the nation at every possible turn. It's a curious paradox, but as I say, the Polish people just seem to have got to come to the conclusion they would just get on regardless of whatever happened. And now we've got this, frankly, rather deranged Europhile government in Poland, which I don't think do any better either. And have also actually had a proven track record of talking up free markets, but effectively doing things like privatizing assets where the government retained control, which I just think is socialism by another means. So it's interesting because the framework works very well. So what is this? Yes, go ahead, please.
Yes, sorry. By the way, that came into my mind right now. If we speak about Poland, I have also a lot of stories from daily life. It's not only a book with, you saw it, with statistics
Indeed.
and numbers, but I had interviews with people in Vietnam and also in Poland. I have a lot of stories from people how it was, and you can imagine this. In the 80s, in the end of the 80s, they had this ration card system in Poland, and you had to stand hours and hours to get some products like, for example, shoes or something like this. And there was no guarantee that you will get it in the end, because maybe they sold out the shoes in your size before, and then you bought some other shoes in the hope that you can exchange them with someone. So it was so crazy, a waste of time. sometimes people had to wait not hours but days.
Yeah.
And you could engage people for money to stand in the line, or older people or young. And in Vietnam it was the same. Young children had to stand there when it was hot or when it was cold, hours and hours. And I have some stories about this in my book. And this is what a ration card system really means in reality, and what a planned economy means. I produced also a film about Poland. You can find it for free on the internet, on YouTube. The title is Poland from Socialism to Prosperity, and it's 35 minutes. So you can see Balcerowicz, and you find all the stories what happened there in Poland.
Yes, and it's a fabulous video as well, actually, Poland from Socialism to Prosperity. I firmly recommend it, ladies and gentlemen. Have a watch when you get a chance over at YouTube. It's a really, really terrific video altogether. And I suppose, therefore, I mean, that brings us to the very interesting issue of, I mean, the political systems in Vietnam and Poland remain remarkably different. But nonetheless, the people share this incredible, for want of a better English word, zeitgeist, to move themselves forward, to want to advance.
Yes, the political different systems, of course. I spoke about a lot of things that Vietnam and Poland have in common. But of course, this is the huge difference, that when socialism collapsed in Poland, also the political system collapsed, and they introduced not only a free market economy, but also democracy. And in Vietnam, of course, this didn't happen. They have still a one-party system. There's no freedom of press. It's not as unfree as in China, for example. You see it if you travel to Vietnam. You can use Facebook, you can use Google, you can use Twitter. What is not possible in China? In China, you have to use this VPN system to go to if you want to use it. But of course, it's a one-party system there, and in Poland, it's a democracy. This is also important to understand how the reforms worked. In Poland, Balcerowicz had no time, because in the moment, I mentioned this before, when he started his reforms, he knew that first something will become worse. And he knew that media will not write especially about their successes, but about everything that went wrong. This was the difference between, in socialist times, there was no freedom of press, and every day everything was wonderful and great with socialism. But in the moment that you had freedom of press, the journalists, as they are everywhere in the world, they don't focus on things that work well, but they focus on things that work not well. And so it was not only the media outlets, it was also the other political parties. Of course, they don't want it, Balcerowicz, to succeed. And so from the first month on, and when some things became bad, they said, oh, you see, he promised everything will become great, but what happens? You have more people without jobs now, and prices increases. And so this was very difficult for Balcerowicz. So he was also a genius in dealing with the public opinion.
Yeah.
And he told me, fortunately, there were some little good news. He told me, I remember one day there was the news, eggs become cheaper. And this was a big headline in newspaper. So some things became better, and this was very important. In contrast, in Vietnam, in a one-party system where you have no freedom of press and no other political parties as competitors, they had more time. They could do it more slowly. They didn't have to make this shock therapy as they did in Poland, because they were not in danger that other political party will win the next elections, or that media will write a lot of negative articles. So this leads us to a problem in the democracy. You know, I believe in democracy in the best system, or as Churchill put it, the best from all bad systems. But a problem with a democracy is, of course, that that in a lot of cases politicians are only, they think about the next elections and about the next polls, and they know that when they start with reforms, there's a risk that first things will become worse, and that they will lose the next election, and that their successor later will gain all the profits, as it was in Germany, where Gerhard Schröder in the beginning of the 2000s did some great economic reforms. He lowered taxes and liberalized the labor market and gave more economic freedom. But as a result, he lost the elections, and his successor, Angela Merkel, who did nothing good for the economy, but she profited from the results. And or remember Maggie Thatcher, when she had the reforms, she was re-elected, but after her, Tony Blair, he found the economy in a good shape, or Bill Clinton after the Ronald Reagan reforms. And this is a problem in the democracy, because we have these elections all 4 years. And then after you won the election, you should start very fast with reforms, but it takes a time, a year maybe, to come all through this process. And then 3 years later, the race for the next elections start, and the competition. And so this is the reason why maybe it's very rare that we have free market reforms in democratic systems. But of course, in another way, if you have a one-party system, there's another risk. If there are as always also in a dictatorship, if the right person is at the top, this person can do something good. But who can guarantee you that the next one will be not bad? And this is what happened in China, for example. In China, they were very successful with this free market reforms from Deng Xiaoping from 1980 to 2010. But with Xi Jinping, he goes now back to more government and less market. And so if I see it right now in Vietnam, we don't have the same development as in China. And so this is the reason why there are a lot of companies who go from China now to Vietnam. To be honest, I don't know much about you know much more about the stock market in Vietnam. I think it was not so great as it should be. But what is the reason? Because
the reason, actually, I can tell you that very quickly. So, I mean, one of Balcerovich's genius gifts was that, first of all, he was very lucky. He had a fabulous man who created the Warsaw Stock Exchange. That was his driving ambition. And Wiesław Rozłucki sits alongside Balcerowicz in the pantheon of greats who helped engage the Polish growth engine. Second of all, Balcerowicz actually said that the government should privatize first. But in fact, the genius point was they said the government should privatize ideally by means of the stock market, which of course was brilliant because he created a thriving stock market in Poland very quickly. In Vietnam, what happened was, unfortunately, the overhang at the top of the communist apparatchiks meant that they were very suspicious of free markets. So they had an exchange in Ho Chi Minh City, and they had an exchange in, now help me here, was it Vientiane? Another major city, I'm trying to remember now, it's completely escaped me. essentially run by government. Now, there's an element of influence over the Warsaw Stock Exchange, which I think is somewhat toxic in recent years from the government, who never really fully let go of the stock exchange when they privatized it. But the Vietnamese stock exchange is very, very strongly controlled by the government. The government has then pushed it into being a monopoly. Poland's was a monopoly. I actually think that was the one mistake that was made in Poland, because there's no competition therein for stock market services. But that's why, because the apparatchiks have held the upper hand, and therefore the economy is dynamic, but the capital market isn't. Alas.
Very important thing. After our call, I will send you this email from, I mentioned this lawyer, Massman, who has very close relations to the government in Vietnam, and also to wealthy people. And maybe you can discuss with him, you can send him an email, what reforms, because this is where you know much more than I know, what reforms they should do on the stock market. I think this would be a very interesting project for you and him.
Be delighted to, absolutely delighted. And I think I know if we're going to start talking about commodities markets, I have a very good friend in the shape of Ms. Anne Berg, who would also accompany me in terms of trying to do anything in that regard. It's very, very interesting. So, I mean, look, that's a fascinating point. You've compared how this looks to the rest of the world. You've compared how these go on. I suppose, really, I mean, usually we would ask you at this stage, Rainer, where does the capital market revolution goes next? But maybe what I should ask you this week is slightly pervert the question, as you've answered it before. Where does the prosperity revolution go next for these countries that are escaping poverty?
It's hard to say, because the problem is that all over the world, the main trend is not escaping poverty today, and it's not more economic freedom, but it's more government, more state, more regulation. If you look at the index of economic freedom from the Heritage Foundation, it's the worst index now since 23 years. And you have it almost everywhere. You have it in China, you have it in the United States, you have it in Europe, back to more government, less market. And they go more and more in the direction of the planned economy. They call it industrial policy. By the way, there's a great book I will send you from reinventing entrepreneurship or something like that. I will send it from a friend of mine from the Beijing University. You should absolutely talk with him. He writes against this industrial policy in China and in the United States. It's the best book I ever read about entrepreneurship. It's by Oxford Press. I will send you after our conversation. So
love to.
So to answer your question, I'm not very positive right now. Hopefully, it works in Argentina. I think the stock exchange was quite good in Argentina in the last.
Yes.
Is this correct? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. It's been going very well. Yep.
Yes. So, but there will be setbacks, of course, and as I mentioned before, it will depend all whether people in Argentina are patient enough. If they are, and if Milei will succeed, then it will start a capitalist revolution in Latin America. People in Colombia and in Venezuela and in Brazil, they will think, when it works there, why it doesn't work in our country, and it will inspire. But of course, on the other hand, if he fails because people are not patient enough, then this will be a huge setback for the libertarian movement all over the world, because everyone will say, you see all this crazy libertarian ideas, go away with it, didn't work there in Argentina. So I cross fingers. I will meet Milei in June in Germany. He comes here. He will get an award, and I cross fingers. And I'm very proud that he's also like my books. He said it also in the public even 2 years ago, that he's a fan of especially of my book, The Power of Capitalism. And so I hope I did some good things with writing my books, if I have readers like Javier Milei.
Well, on that note, I mean, I don't think you can get better than managing to have a president of a major economic nation throughout the world endorsing your books. Thank you very much, Rainer Zitelmann. Next week, we're going to be talking with Steve Zwick, returning to the show. It's going to be all about carbon market developments with one of the absolute experts in the field, my old friend. And ladies and gentlemen, it remains for me today to only say a huge thank you to Anne Berg for her fabulous input during the course of this show. Dr. Rainer Zitelmann joining us for the fourth time, and still as fresh as ever. We could have talked for hours about this incredibly exciting topic. I wish you every success in the future out there talking about the most important thing of all, which is growth and adding prosperity to this world. I do hope that you'll pass on our best wishes to President Milei if you meet him as well, because he is the man who is certainly in the forefront of trying to drive development right now. This has been a fantastic show, talking all about how nations escape poverty. Thank you very much to our production team of Herminia, Natalie and Mary. My name is Patrick L. Young. We'll be back same time next week. And don't forget, pick up at least one, if not all of those 4 books that we have profiled with Dr. Rainer Zitelmann in recent months on IPO-VID. Have a great week, ladies and gentlemen, in life and markets.
Thank you.